Let's see. Today is July 25th, 2023. My name is Sophia Gavea, and I'm here today with Dr. Vida Yao on behalf of the Houston Asian American Archive at Rice University. Thank you so much for your time and agreeing to share your story with us. I think so. Just in terms of like the layout of the questions, I think we're going to start with your early life and then move into your career and then end with some sort of identity, personal, like hobbies stuff type questions.
Sure. Sure. Sounds great. Thanks for
Awesome.
having me.
Thank you for joining us. So my first question, if you could just state your date of birth and where you were born or where you grew up really quick.
Oh, sure. So my date of birth is March 10th, 1987. I was born in Vancouver, Canada, and that's where I grew up entirely. And I moved when I was maybe 21, but otherwise, yes, I had my entire early adult life and earlier than that in Vancouver, Canada.
Okay. And can you talk about the neighborhood that you grew up in Vancouver?
Oh, the neighborhood. So I grew up in two neighborhoods. The first was a neighborhood that's named Coquitlam. And my parents, my parents moved there from living out at the University of British Columbia, where my dad was doing his PhD. And I don't have that many memories of anything before Coquitlam, not that many. Coquitlam was a very kind of suburban, I would say middle-class neighborhood. It's changed a lot since I grew up. And Vancouver has changed a lot since I grew up there. And so I spent probably until I think I was in the sixth grade. We were in Vancouver, and then my parents, I think largely because they wanted my brother and I, my older brother and I, to go to a better public school, moved us into a neighborhood on the North Shore of Vancouver, in West Vancouver, which is, I would say, it was a bit out of place there. It's a much more upper middle class to just extraordinarily wealthy neighborhood. And then I lived there until I started my undergrad degree at the University of British Columbia.
And do you have any siblings or can you talk about like your family?
Yeah, so I have an older brother named Charlie. He still lives in Vancouver. He's 3 years older. He was born in China, in Shanghai, and moved with my mother to Vancouver. And I was born in Vancouver. Shortly after that, and then my parents were actually supposed to move back to China with me in tow as the second child in violation of the one-child policy. But that didn't end up happening. I don't know if we will get into that, but that didn't end up happening. And so it was my parents, my brother, and I growing up in Vancouver. And then at a certain point, my father's mother, my grandmother, moved in with us. She moved from Shanghai and she immigrated. She became a Canadian citizen. But kind of the main reason for her to move to Vancouver was that so she could help raise me and my brother while my parents both worked full time.
What did your parents do for a living?
So my dad, after getting his PhD, he went in civil engineering. He went into private industry. And he worked for different private firms in Vancouver and retired 2 years ago. My mother worked for the Immigrant Services Society in British Columbia, which was a government agency that prepared new immigrants for their kind of career transition in Canada. So she would find them either training or find them ways to qualify their certification in Canada. And so she did that for a good number of decades, and then I think retired maybe 6 years ago.
Thanks. And Do you have like a favorite memory from childhood or anything you'd like to share about growing up?
A favorite memory from childhood. I remember, I would say probably my most like something that really characterized my childhood, which I think um, I experience less of just because I'm older and also because I think the world has sort of changed, um, is that I think I was outdoors a lot. Um, I Yeah, I was outdoors a lot. I was kind of unsupervised growing up when I was very young, which it's a mixed bag. but but the thing that I really remember enjoying about being unsupervised was that I was just outside a lot and always kind of doing things either with like nature or plants, just being outside. I also had a lot of pets growing up. I had a lot of guinea pigs. I think I had like an inappropriate number of guinea pigs. And there was always a dog, there were sometimes rabbits. I mean, I was just kind of surrounded by animals. I think because my mom grew up with a lot of animals in her life, and so she just thought it was kind of normal to have a lot of pets in the house. And that was just really distinctive and wonderful. And I think I don't really, I mean, I have a dog now, but it wasn't at all like growing up where there were just always living things around all the time, which was just exciting and fun as a kid.
Were you sort of like an independent child, or did you like were you close with your brother at all growing up?
We were kind of, I don't know, we were around each other a lot. I don't know if exactly we were, he was older and he was a boy. Like, I think there was a lot of, you know, I had like kind of a younger sibling's desire to do a lot of the stuff that he was doing, but I was like younger and I was a girl, um and I think, he wanted to like do cool stuff with his like friends, that like boy stuff. And so no, so I wouldn't really hang out with him that much. Um uh and so yeah, I was pretty independent. I think I spent a lot of time, yeah, like by myself, outside in the yard, or I would spend a lot of time kind of reading. I was a very avid reader from like a pretty young age. And so yeah, I spent a lot of time by myself. And um at school I had some friends, but like I think maybe partly because of the demographics of where I grew up. I don't want to speculate too much because I could, there's a way in which I could just be wrong about this, but I do remember sort of not really fitting in. Like, I felt like we were these kind of weird immigrant kids. And at the time in Vancouver, like, again, Vancouver has changed completely. I think something like, I don't even know, like 40 to 50% of the, of the immigrant population in Canada now is mainland, or sorry, in Vancouver now is mainland Chinese. I don't know the exact number, but it's just, there's been a huge wave of immigration from mainland China in the last maybe 15 years that just wasn't there when my parents immigrated. They immigrated at a very unusual time for there to be mainland Chinese in Canada. And so, yeah, I felt like kind of like I didn't really fit in with the other Chinese kids because they were either Cantonese speakers or they had immigrated to Canada much earlier. Um, and then I didn't really fit in with the white kids. I didn't really fit in with the Sikh kids. And so, yeah, so I spent a lot of time in my early childhood by myself. And this was also probably another reason for why my parents um, felt like they wanted to move us into this other neighborhood. It's partly because it had better public schools, but also partly because it was just much, much more racially diverse, culturally diverse, and integrated than Coquitlam was.
That actually kind of leads perfectly into my next question. You touched on it a little bit, but how would you describe the Asian American community, where you grew up in Vancouver? I guess like comparing both of the different neighborhoods.
Yeah, so I can't really say that Coquitlam had an Asian American. I mean, I do remember that it had a Sikh community. And I do remember that there were some Chinese kids. Like, again, I was young, so it's hard know how accurate my representation of this was. I also had like very confused racial categories because I feel like race is something that, like, unless somebody tells you the rules, you're just sort of like guessing and figuring it out on your own. And so in Coquitlam, there were some other Asian kids, but again, they were either from Hong Kong or Taiwan. The Taiwanese kids really, I think they did not identify with being mainland Chinese. And they especially didn't identify with being like an immigrant from mainland China. And so, yeah, I think that my parents themselves were probably quite isolated. My dad, actually, I was just in Vancouver seeing my parents, and my dad told me that when he moved to Vancouver to start his PhD, he was the only Yao in the phone book. That is spelled YAO. There were other Yaos that were spelled with different romanization, but the significance of the spelling of my last name YAO marks that he was like the first mainland Chinese Yao in Vancouver at the time. And they also linguistically were set apart from other if there were other mainland Chinese people, they were linguistically set apart because my parents spoke a dialect of China. They can speak Mandarin, they can speak standard Mandarin, but at home they would speak Shanghainese. Shanghainese is like their mother language. They feel much more comfortable in Shanghainese, and there were no Shanghainese speakers. I almost, like, except for, my parents' friends who they reconnected with in Vancouver, I would almost never hear Shanghainese spoken. And so I don't think there was an Asian American community that I think my parents or my brother or I felt a part of in Coquitlam. When we moved to West Vancouver, I think things were they were different. I mean, I think I was still probably one of the few mainland Chinese students at the time, but my friend group was just incredibly diverse. I mean, I'm still friends with them to this day, but in my closest friends, like, I have one of my closest friends was from Pakistan. Another close friend's mother was Shanghainese and Taiwanese, and her father was Cantonese. And so there was just a kind of because of the difference of the families that moved to this wealthier neighborhood and sent their kids to the public school there. They were just from they were from Iran, Iraq, like just so many different countries that there didn't feel like there was like a plurality of one race or one culture. And so we were just kind of all mixed together. And then I felt like my Asianness didn't like stand apart and make me unusual in any way. We were all from different places. Our parents spoke different languages. We'd go to each other's houses. Two of my really good friends are Korean. Like, it just felt like a big mishmash of different cultures. And that was really, looking back at it now, it's something that I see as also sort of distinct and unusual as a way to grow up, but was really super important, I think, for my own sense of who I was and where I fit in and the kind of world that was available to me once I went to that school.
Yeah, that sounds kind of incredible. Do you think sort of having that experience with a really diverse background community that you grew up in has impacted your perception of, or I guess just the way you kind of conceptualize different people at an early age?
Yeah, I think I just, it was early enough. Again, I think I started in this new neighborhood when I was sixth grade or something like that. It was early enough that then I think I just sort of assumed that it was normal to be sort of surrounded by so many different cultures and so many different languages. And for it, I was lucky. I think there was probably still some cultural and racial like self-segregating in high school, because it's just like a thing that high schoolers tend to do. You know, you feel more comfortable around people who, whatever, you share certain things in common with. But I didn't have that experience again with my close friends. And so I learned, like, I think I just learned a lot about the other ways in which people live and the other ways in which people interact with one another, and the different kind of family expectations that different cultures bring to bear in their relations to their kids. And all of that just sort of seems so normal to me that then kind of when I left those circumstances, then sometimes I find it surprising to encounter like one very dominant culture or one very dominant way of being. And but it, you know, but I think it has helped me sort of be able to situate different ways in which people behave and understand the world. And there's a certain level where you know, for me, I just kind of accept that there are these differences, and I appreciate these differences, and I kind of, you know, it's something that I really is really actually just so important to me that I forget how much it matters to me, these cultural differences between people. And yeah, I really loved it. Like I really appreciated it and loved it. And so kind of like, I think when I moved to the States, especially when I started grad school, it was a kind of shock to me to lose that and to not have that be something that's easily accessible, and to realize that so much of North America really is quite segregated. And there aren't these spaces where it's normal to have these kind of just basic, you know, just differences of style and differences of different ways of interacting that you know. Anyway, I think it really did change a lot for me in ways that were overall really important and good for my life.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. I guess another question I had was whether you were able, or your family sort of was able to maintain a connection to mainland China or the places where your parents grew up, and if you had any like relatives that were still living there.
Yeah, almost all of my relatives still live there. I have a cousin who has left and is doing her PhD in the UK, but almost all of my relatives still live in China. I would visit. It was really hard. I mean, they actually couldn't go back to China for a really long time. And then when they became Canadian citizens, that sort of it throws it makes it complicated, their relationships with mainland China. And of course, it's one of those situations where so much of the ease of going to China or the ease of communicating with people in China depends so much on these huge political issues of whether or not, you know, China, how open or not China is to the rest of the world. There have been periods where, you know, there was a lot of reason for optimism. There was an opening up, and you know, even the last time that I was in China, which was 2013, it still felt very like it felt like it was opening up and becoming more of a cosmopolitan country, just in terms of like the, you know, the governance of it. And now I'm not so sure. Like it's always just a little bit dicey. And so so my mom actually, she still goes back to China pretty frequently to take care of my grandfather and her sister who has a mental disability. And so so there's the connection there. But I would say that, you know, in Canada, I would say that there wasn't there again, even when we moved to West Vancouver, even though I felt kind of like less isolated as an Asian person, I don't think that there was like we never had any kind of explicit connection to an Asian American community. I think also because my parents are still like kind of linguistically isolated. It's not common to find Shanghainese speakers And so they just don't feel like a natural connection with the Asian American community, I think, in North America. And so I never felt like, we were part of this kind of more explicit, self-consciously created political or social community. And so, yeah, I feel, uh, and I don't know. I think because of their history, maybe my parents don't feel, I think, of course they feel especially connected to China because of the people and the culture, but again, because of difficulties in the political situation, it can be hard to feel connected to the country as a nation.
Yeah. And would you mind sharing some just experiences or memories you have traveling to China growing up with your family?
Yeah, so let me think. Um, the first time I went to China was before, God, see, I don't even, my history is kind of sketchy, but it was before the kind of major economic boons of the 90s, of the late 90s, in 2000. So a lot of my memories were kind of about, how old would I have been? Um, maybe we went to 97s, maybe I was 10. A lot of my memories were of kind of what appeared to me at the time to be sort of severe disparities in just in kind of living standards. Like I remember being kind of young and shocked by some of the experiences that I had a chance. Some of that was just, of course, just cultural differences, but some of it was just this feeling like this is what it's like to, come from a relatively middle class sort of um, developed country, and to visit a country that was really trying to pull itself out of a long history um, of of severe deprivation. Like that was clear to me. Again, things have changed so much since then in China, in terms of economic growth. And so over the years, that became less stark. And then it became kind of more stark, the ways in which China had accumulated vast amounts of wealth, and the insane wealth that then exists in places like Shanghai and Beijing, then contrasted kind of greatly with my experience of this kind of middle class existence in Canada. So that pendulum shift is probably something that was really, really dramatic for me to understand, and to then also get like more of a perspective on the sort of struggles that my parents had in China, and the differences between my life and their life. Like I think it's a common thing for a lot of Asian Americans whose parents immigrated from certain countries in Asia, to like realize just how much harder they had it. And so that was probably the most visceral experience, being young and being like, oh, it's not just this intellectual sense of, oh, that they had it harder than me. It was a real visceral sense of what they were coming out of, and the kind of poverty they were coming out of, and what they had to struggle against. But I also, I remember a lot of beauty. I think of China is just so different from the natural beauty of Canada. And a lot of it, I think a lot of it because it is cultivated beauty. So I remember the architecture and the ponds and the gardens and things like that. But then I would say probably the most distinctive memory was just and every time I go back to China, it's the same sort of feeling, that it's because it's so densely populated, just the sort of chaos and cacophony and the loudness and the just how it's just a mass of human activity, and in some ways I think I felt like, even though I appreciated Vancouver in a lot of ways, that there's a way in which it feels very quiet and quaint and sort of boring in comparison to these huge centers of human culture and activity. And I was very drawn to that growing up.
And I think sort of shifting gears into academics and career and all that. I guess growing up, did you have like a favorite subject in school at all?
I knew that I really liked writing and reading, but I don't think I had a favorite subject. It's just any subject in which I could do those two things. I really liked. So history, I guess English, I guess, but whatever version of like those kind, whatever in any class that those skills were being exercised. In high school, I got very involved in in drama and like theater. I think that was actually still a version of my love of reading and writing. It was just like the performance aspect of really understanding texts in this different way, where you actually have to think about how a play would be represented visually. I think there's still probably all connected interests. And so yeah, I didn't have any interest or knowledge of like philosophy as a discipline. And so that was never a thing in growing up, that I even if it were true that I was attracted to philosophical thinking, it was never under that guise, because we didn't have philosophy classes in elementary or high school.
Sounds really cool, theater. Were there any like productions that you were part of that you enjoyed or remember?
Yeah, like a lot we did. It was kind of it's kind of funny. Again, it's one of those things where you realize how unusual it was. But the high school that I went to actually had a pretty serious theater program. And so every other year we would put on a very, very big musical production. And so the years that I was there, we did Grease, and then we did Footloose, and then we did 42nd Street. And I was more and more involved as you kind of get old, up higher in the grades, you become more and more involved. And so by the time we did 42nd Street, I was a senior. And I was not a lead in the musical, because I don't have any training or skill in dancing or singing. But then in the in-between years, we would do kind of a big play. And so there was one year we did Father of the Bride, and then there was another year. But the ones that, for me, I think the plays that were the most special to me were when we would do these sort of like activities around I don't know, we wouldn't put on an entire play by Shakespeare, but we would kind of do acts, like. And so I think we did Taming of the Shrew. I think we did A Midsummer's Night's Dream. Like, those were really fun. But then I think probably the one that's most distinctive to me is that we did a version of a Greek tragedy called Antigone, and I played Antigone's sister Ismene, and it was just so over the top and like so dramatic that I love that. We also did The Lottery by Shirley Jackson, and so that was another play that I think it was just so fun to be able to be part of these, to just act out these kind of extremely, when and I was like a teenager anyway, it's kind of like an over dramatic, over emotional teenager. So it kind of gave me the space to be this other person who could be totally crazy. And so I really loved, yeah, I was very, yeah, I looking back on it, I was very involved with this kind of those sorts of activities. And I really, they were all pretty memorable in their own ways, the different plays and the different musicals. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot of fun. I was actually planning on asking this question later, but talking about your experience in theater sort of made me think of it. I know in previous interviews you had mentioned being really interested in emotions. Do you think
Yeah.
that your experience in theater played any role in that, or they're connected somehow?
Yeah, I think so. I think because when you're given a play, you really are just, you get some stage directions, and you get the dialogue, or you get the words, but you do sort of really have to, if you're going to take it seriously, like, and I think I probably did, because I was like a sort of pretentious teenager, you have to interpret why people would be saying or doing what they're doing. Like, that's up to you. in conversation with like your director or whatever like that. And so it was a lot of just like, why would anybody say this, and and how would they say it, and why would it make sense that they were saying this? And a lot of times the answer is actually not very obvious. And you can kind of have an intuitive understanding of what's going on in a play and then like act it out. But I do think it sort of turned on those engines of like trying to reinterpret and understand what's really going on with somebody and why they're saying what they're saying or doing what they're doing, and why, you know, and why it's all, you know, if it is a matter of just like reacting to what other people are doing or saying, it's all this, the emotions just play such a huge role in both kind of giving us what seem to be the most obvious interpretations, but then also the non-obvious interpretations. You know, you could just think, oh, someone's saying this because they're angry, but actually you realize that the reason why they're angry is because they're ashamed of themselves. And so, you know, if you're taking the representation of that seriously, you kind of have to be able to have a sense of what would it mean for both of those emotions to show up in one action, you know. And so yeah, I think it probably turned on a lot of the interests that I still have in my professional career.
That's really interesting. And so before we kind of go more in depth in your academic career and your professional career, would you mind just giving us a brief sort of overview of your academic background and journey?
Yeah, so I started at the University of British Columbia as an undergrad. I left there to do an exchange program with Fulbright Canada to UC Berkeley, where then I did a year of classes and then a year of research assistance. And during that time, I applied for grad school. I got accepted to the PhD program at the University of North Carolina. I finished my PhD program there after 6 years, and then I arrived at Rice in 2016.
Nice. Um, so when and how did you sort of decide you wanted to pursue a career in philosophy?
I knew I was interested. I sort of developed an interest in philosophy kind of in my second year of undergrad. I Again, I don't know that I really understood that that's what I was interested in. And philosophy itself is a kind of contested subject. And so there were classes, and I didn't really understand at the time. So there were some classes I felt very invested in, very interested in, and some classes that totally turned me off. And I didn't really know why. And now I have a better understanding of why that is and why there's different approaches in philosophy that I like and some that I don't like. I tend to like philosophy that has connections to the other humanistic disciplines. I tend to like philosophy that can speak to you know, human psychology and human emotions. And so usually there's some connection with like literature or film or something like that. I don't tend to like very, very abstract and very kind of like overly technical forms of philosophical work. And I'm still not attracted to that work. And I wasn't when I was an undergrad. So it took a while for me to figure out that I was still interested in philosophy. So I took English classes, I took history classes. I was really all over the place trying to figure out like, what is this kind of, trying to get the sense of like, what is it that I'm really interested in here? And then it ended up really just being that I was still majoring in philosophy and history. Most of I think a lot of the feedback I got on my history papers were something of the sort like, oh, you're interested in kind of like intellectual history, which bridges with philosophical thinking. I'd sort of turn everything into like an argument about how ideas fit together. And so that sort of pushed me even further into philosophy. But then it really, you know, it didn't totally crystallize until I think I got to Berkeley, and then grad school really seemed like a real live option. And I still think even then, I didn't think about it as like a career, really. I just thought, I don't know exactly what else to do with my life. Like I knew that I liked reading and I knew that I liked writing, but it's not obvious what trajectory to take with that. And I think also I didn't have the ambition of thinking like I could ever be like a writer. Like that seemed totally that seemed crazy to me. I mean, that was just not at all anything that was available to me as a real ambition. That was like going to the moon or something. It just wasn't, it didn't seem possible. And so it kind of, I think going to grad school seemed like a much more, I don't know, substantive sort of project for me to take on, given that I had no idea what else to, what to do with my life. And I just thought, I'll take classes, I'll meet interesting people, like I'll get to do this work, and then we'll see if it turns into something beyond that. And so kind of luckily enough, it has, but the idea of it as a career was just never really something like at the forefront of my mind. But I'm very, I'm very grateful and happy that it's worked out that way.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Um, do you have any memories sort of as a student, since you sort of like went from Vancouver to Berkeley and then ended in Houston? Like what were your experiences in those three different places and how would you compare them?
So I was really, I really loved San Francisco. It was kind of, I mean, leaving Canada was also just really exciting for me. I was really unhappy by the time with living in Canada by the time I left living in Vancouver. Um, um, I, I just wanted, I don't know, like I was saying, I kind of felt that, like when I was saying the contrast between China and Canada, or just China just felt like it had so much substance and history and excitement. And like, I always, even though Vancouver has a lot of virtues, it never felt like a real place to me. It never felt like a real, where people were ambitious and doing things, or just not even, ambitious, not even the right word, just that they were like alive and vibrant and excited about life. That was just not something that I experienced in general about the culture in Vancouver. So going to San Francisco was really exciting because it was there. I mean, there were people, there were just people who wanted to just make music or make art or just or become writers. Like these kind of, again, it's like ambition's not exactly the right word. It's because it's not really about like making a name for yourself or having a career. It's just sort of like being excited about life and moving to the States. It felt like that was a real cultural difference between Canada and the United States. And then Chapel Hill, where I did my grad program, it was South. I never thought that I would live in the South. I really loved it. I loved Chapel Hill. It was beautiful. It was a different kind of period of my life since grad school is so demanding. You kind of don't really, you kind of like become like a monk in a certain way. You don't really engage with the world as much anymore because you're just so focused on or at least I experience it as just like, I just have this dominating project in my life. And sometimes it felt very oppressive and sometimes it felt great, but it was just a different way of existing for like 6 years where I didn't feel like, oh, there's this whole world in front of me. It was kind of like, no, there's these books and there's these classes and this is my world for now, which was a different experience and great. And then moving to Houston, I kind of felt again that a version of that feeling that I got in San Francisco, which is like, it's alive and there's people here and they're excited about the world and there's this energy that Houston has that I was immediately attracted to and really, really loved. And I still love. And I think it's actually a very rare sort of energetic chaos that Houston has that I love. And I think even San Francisco now and Berkeley, they kind of don't really have it anymore. It's so expensive to live there. It's hard for young people. It's hard for creative people. But Houston kind of seems right now to be able to generate that sort of energy, which is just wonderful. It's a wonderful part of the city.
I think that's definitely a great way of characterizing sort of the city of Houston, I think. Um, so did you have any mentors as you were a student or a grad student that sort of helped shape your experiences like going through academics?
Yeah, so probably my main mentor was my advisor, Susan Wolf at Chapel Hill. She's still in a lot of ways a mentor to me. Yeah, she's probably the kind of, there were other people who, of course, were amazing advisors and gave me a lot of guidance. I think but I think just sort of philosophically and almost as like a model of like personal ethic, my advisor really was very important for my development into the kind of philosopher that I am, but also just the sort of attitude toward a lot of the attitude that I have toward life and the way in which philosophy fits into my life, I think was just something that she inspired, and which has been very, yeah, it's just, she doesn't, she will never understand the extent to which she's been this kind of formative person for me. And so I'm very lucky that she was my advisor, and that again, she's still kind of one of my main mentors in life in general.
Yeah, that's sort of relationship sounds really important and insightful. Um, so I know on your website you talked about your experiences as a fellow at UC Berkeley with the former professor John Searle, who has since like a lot of documented cases of sexual harassment and assault um have become part of public record. I was wondering if you could sort of touch on your experiences with that and how that affected the way you move through academics as a result.
Yeah, yeah, it's still a little bit, it's still a little bit difficult for me to talk about. I think partly because and there's a way in which that experience still feels unresolved to me in terms of what it means for my life and for my life with philosophy. um I think, what the most shocking thing to me was that, especially given the area that I that I work in, the most shocking aspect of the whole experience to me was how much I was able to convince myself for so many years that like what had happened, or my experience with him, I mean, it wasn't like an event. This is sort of what's confusing about it, is I worked for him for about a year and a half, and and sort of like existing under like persistent, what I mean, sexual harassment is not even like the right word for it in a way, but the thing that was sort of unusual about it was how, when you're just subjected to it kind of persistently, it really distorts your it distorted my grasp of reality. I think there's no other way to put it. I kind of, yeah, and so I think having had such a breach of my grasp of the world, I think leaving Berkeley, then I just needed to kind of very quickly like close it up and just not think about it. And I didn't think about it, or I thought I didn't think about it for until, so I left Berkeley in 2010. And then I didn't think about it until much later, when a journalist from BuzzFeed reached out to me. But I decided not to comment. So this was before the case was made public. It wasn't even a decision. I just couldn't comment. Like I couldn't even let myself think about it. And that was in 2016, my first year at Rice. And I was just like, beginning assistant professor, I was still very anxious about starting this new position. And I just didn't have any space. I didn't have any space to even be able to touch it. But then things really kind of were settled by 2019. Like it was all public. It sort of, I was more established in my sense of myself as trying to become my own philosopher and become have this own career of my own. And so that it just put it put too much pressure on it. Reality sort of forced itself back on me. And so it was a difficult time. It was a very difficult time, and I'm doing much better now. But it was, I think, yeah. So I think I was, the lesson that I've learned from it is just how completely mysterious we can be to ourselves, and just the extent to which we can have really no idea what's going on in our own minds. Like I think I didn't understand that. I understood it at a distance before going through all of this. But then seeing it with my own mind is just, it was like a very visceral, vivid version of that lesson that I think only going through it would have really taught me.
Thank you for sharing. I'm so sorry that that happened to you, but I'm glad to hear that you're doing better now. And this question I kind of just thought of, so I'm sorry I didn't run this by you
No,
beforehand.
that's fine. Yeah.
But I know on your website you had mentioned being interested in hearing from other women who had experienced or gone through similar things. Um, what do you think, I guess, the role of community has been in trying to make sense of what happened to you? Or do you think the sort of connections you've been able to make with other victims has been productive, I guess, for you or meaningful?
Yeah, I think that's still an open question. I think, honestly, because I think the other, um, it's amazing. A lot of the other people who reached out to me, um, it's actually, and I'm not sure why. I'm not sure if it's because of the nature of the harassment, and in some cases, assault, I would say, um, or because of peculiarities of of him as a person and as a philosopher and his stature in the profession, or maybe because of the culture that was sort of generated around keeping this all very, I don't know, like it wasn't something that was open and discussed at all at Berkeley, obviously. It was everyone had to be very tight-lipped about it for their, I don't know, I don't want to speculate too much on why. But under those conditions, I mean, it's still, I think, extremely painful and extremely difficult for those other people to speak about it. Um, and I think with any kind of formation of community around an issue that's so traumatic, you can't, there's something also, um, like one should not force another person to speak about it if they can't. I was lucky enough to have, support from Rice, and that I could go on medical leave. Like I had the time and the space, and I had the resources to get the therapy that I needed. But if you don't have that space, you don't have the time, or if you just don't want to do it, like I think it's too much to ask people to follow up on it and to like form a community around it. So I think it's still up in I think it's still up in the air. I think maybe at some point there will be more of a public or just like a shared understanding of what happened to all of us. But I'm really not sure if that will happen. I'm not sure who needs that at this point. I think there's ways in which I would benefit from it. And then there's also ways in which I just think it's not an easy answer. There's a certain point where you just think, I just want to move on with my life, and I don't need this to hang over me, or it doesn't feel like it does, and I don't want to open it up again. And so I totally sympathize that, like, for some of these women, and because the other thing that's sort of shocking is because he worked at Berkeley for so long, this is over generations. I mean, one of the women who wrote to me, I think is in her 80s. So it spans so many decades of these women dealing with the same person and the same problems, at the same institution. And it's like shocking that that's the case, but that's the reality. But yeah, again, I'm not sure if a community around that is something that will be formed, or would even be helpful to me or anyone else. I do think that sort of more, I think, but I think in general, to answer it just like at a general level, finding people who are supportive and understanding, in philosophy, and maybe that's because of philosophy. I wouldn't generalize this to other sorts of professions, but because it's philosophy, I have found that extremely helpful. I think if I hadn't found a community of people who could relate in some way, or feel like the philosophical community was willing to acknowledge this or accept this. I think it would have been too alienating to stay really in this profession, because it's such a personal profession. Like what we do is so personal. And I feel like I have to be able to be myself in my work at some level. And this is part of my history with this profession.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, that definitely, I can understand how some people would prefer to just kind of close that chapter of their lives.
Yeah.
So my next question is, I know at Rice you organized the humanistic ethics workshop.
Yeah.
I was wondering, like, how would you or I guess define humanistic ethics, and how is it different from ethics in general?
Yeah. So I haven't, I'm not too explicit about this because I kind of don't, I don't want to, you know, determine for other people what that could mean for them. And actually there was just this last summer, there was a version of the workshop that was held at King's College in London, which I didn't organize. So it was kind of its own iteration or version or understanding of what humanistic ethics is. I would say that the reason why I started the workshop, and why I still kind of make efforts toward forming something like an intellectual community around this idea, is that I think that philosophical ethics is really something that is relevant to human life. That is, the kind of questions that it can ask and the answers that it can supply are all sort of relevant. They make sense within living a human life. And there are strands of philosophical ethical thought that maybe they think that that's what they're doing, but they tend to encourage certain levels of abstraction that where it's no longer clear that what they're offering to somebody is like a real deliberative question or answer. So like, to just give maybe an example of this, like a common problem that's presented to undergraduates who take an ethics class in philosophy is the trolley problem. I don't know if do you know anything about this?
Yeah, it's funny. I was actually like a couple days ago talking with my coworker I work at a boba shop about this question.
Yeah. And it's not like that's not like, there is something that the question is getting at. But the kind of framework, which is like the framework that gives rise to the question, which is a consequentialist framework. It's like thinking about, okay, I perform one action and I'm asking like, what are the best consequences overall? That framing of the situation is already pretty artificial. It's not like no one would ever find themselves in that circumstance. They might find themselves in the circumstance, but there's a lot of reasons why we have to do a lot of ethical like thinking, and set up institutions and set up rules and set up all of these situations such that people tend to not find themselves in those circumstances. And we might think like the reason why we don't want people to find themselves in the circumstances is because you might think there's really not a good answer. Like we run into this, it's just a human conflict where you might not be able to resolve it. For me, it doesn't seem right to think that there's like the rational answer. I think it makes sense that different people would come to different answers and they would feel torn and they would feel regret no matter what they did. And so precisely because of that reason, we try to create worlds in which we live, social structures in which we live, where people don't have to face those kinds of problems. Or, there's other versions of questions like, okay, if you had to pick between a world in which, there were 100 starving people, and a world in which there were 200 people who were not starving, but just like slightly hungry or something like that. And I'm like, that is not a real question that anyone would ever face. I'm fine, philosophers should feel free to do whatever they want, but at the time that I started the conference, I was feeling a little bit like there's a lot of energy surrounding these questions that have become somewhat detached from human life. And that can be fine. That's not the problem in and of itself. It's just that they tend to obscure or mask a lot of the actual questions that people might actually be wondering about, and which I think philosophy can serve well. Like, so philosophy can help us frame those questions properly. Philosophy can see us what hangs on what else. It might not be able to give us the answer, but it just shows us the significance of different answers that might be available to us. And that's the kind of work that I wanted to see more of. And so that's one respect in which it's like humanistic. It's oriented around like actual grounded human experience. And I also think that another way in which I think ethics can be made more humanistic is if it has a more realistic, more like a more realistic understanding of, again, like human emotion, human psychology, the way in which we experience the world. And I wanted to see more work that did that, and didn't give us an idealized version of what we're like when we're rational, but actually, for example, but actually pays attention to the weird ways in which we're deeply not rational, but but still understandable to one another, and work from those materials to come up with the questions and the answers that philosophy should be asking and answering.
Sure. Yeah, that sounds so interesting. So could you give an example of some of the things that you would do in the workshop to sort of work towards the more humanistic version of ethics that was like less idealized that you talked about?
Yeah, so I'm pretty hands off about it. I mean, in the sense that once it's up and running, I don't think I don't know that I want to impose any particular version of my view of this. But where I do kind of have a heavy hand is in inviting particular people. And so I usually, I'll read through the journals, I'll hear from other people. Oh, there's somebody who's working on this question in this way that I find very interesting. And I will invite them out and they'll give a paper, and then I'll sort of just, they will set the mood. The people themselves will set the tone and set the way in which, I want them to determine sort of like their own interpretation, because if I feel like if I've invited them, they've already kind of passed a bar for me where I think I want to know what they think about how to make ethics more humanistic. Oh, and one other strand, for example, this is something that, I also agree with, but I sometimes forget. But one important respect in which I think ethics is more humanist, becomes more realistic and becomes less idealized and less abstract, is by being really grounded in understanding the current human situation, which we can't do without the other humanistic disciplines like history and like English and like, the work that's done in other areas that ask similar questions but maybe have different methods. And we need a kind of shared sense of where we are, where we came from, and that, again, that grounds us in asking questions and answering them in a way that a lot of philosophy just doesn't. It's like pure, just speculation, totally apart from what the questions might mean to a particular person within a particular culture.
Yeah, thank you for expanding that. That's super cool. Okay, so we're back for part two of the interview a couple of days later. Hopefully we don't run into any more connection troubles. But to start off, if you could highlight one aspect of your research to somebody, what would it be?
So I would probably highlight I would highlight a couple of different tensions that I like to focus on. There's sort of tensions that are within our own psychologies. And I've always been interested in sort of exploring different conflicts and tensions within human psychology. But the one that I'm focused in right now on has to do with my research on love, but more specifically on the desire for intimacy and the desire for closeness. And part of what I find interesting about that desire is because it's often, first of all, it's often overlooked by contemporary philosophers, but also historical philosophers. It's either overlooked or it's sort of transformed into something kind of unrecognizable. But the other thing that I find really interesting about it is because it seems paired also with this tension that is, we want closeness, but we also want distance. And there's a way in which I don't know if this is ever something that's resolvable, like in our psyches or within our lives, but it's a tension that we have to be aware of and recognize and acknowledge, even if it's a case that there's not really anything to do about it. And if I don't think that there is, in fact, anything that we should do about it, it's just kind of a product of what it's like to be human.
Thank you for sharing. I was just kind of curious, how did you sort of become I guess come across this tension that made you want to research more or look into it more?
Oh, I think probably it was a combination of reading, reading a lot of philosophy and sort of not uh just not, it's not that I knew that I was even looking for something that was missing, but or that I knew that there was something missing, but I always felt like there was something missing. And I had that feeling that something was missing because I think probably, I just experience a lot of my own psychic tension and conflict. Um, and then this was also paired with kind of a sense that philosophy in general, and I mean, I think it's just a bad habit that we all have in philosophy, and there's interesting different explanations for why that is. But whenever there's something that seems kind of like an irresolvable conflict or tension or something like that, we have a tendency of trying to find a way to harmonize it immediately. And if we can't harmonize it, then we tend to ignore it. And that's just a kind of across the board with any kind of tension or conflict. Like logical conflict or tension is like one place, but like in ethics, it's a lot of like, again, psychic tension, tension between values. And so I think it was following that sort of suspicion that maybe this was another thing that had been overlooked by the philosophical views that I've been reading.
Thanks for sharing. That's definitely super interesting. So for the next question, could you talk a little bit more about what your experience has been as an Asian American woman in academics and in philosophy?
Sure. So I think it's a bit, um, so I think a lot of Asians in academia are having like a moment right now with this um, overturning of affirmative action. I mean, in general, I think Asians play like a sort of unusual, we have sort of an unusual and distinctive role in academia. And in some fields where arguably are very overrepresented, and in other fields like in philosophy we're very underrepresented. And I think I don't know what the most recent statistics are, but it's something like 0.01% of tenured faculty in philosophy are non-white women. And so that's including Asians, that's including like any non-white women. And so it's a bit like, I feel like this is another place where I think like questions about just there's a tension and a conflict. It's not a bad one, but it is a place where identity, you kind of have to have these different views about the way in which what it signifies about the status of Asians in general, if it signifies anything, and also just the way in which like I experience being an Asian woman in philosophy. And so that's part of like, I don't know that I have any real sense of myself as experiencing being Asian in philosophy spaces. I think being a woman is something that's much more salient to me, or made more salient to me, just because the gender disparity in philosophy is sort of so egregious. I mean, it's and it's an unusual. It changes the dynamics in like a very unusual way. So it's most stark, if I'm like interacting with a social group that's more balanced or is more women, and then I go to work or I go to a conference It is just, you just feel it. It's very, very visceral, the difference being in a room where it's almost all men.
Have you noticed any changes with regard to being a woman in philosophy, like over the years?
Yes, so I think there's been like just with other cultural changes. This has been a very kind of dramatic and rapid change. Of course, like we had the whole Me Too kind of cultural movement. But right, when I started in philosophy, I don't think people really reflected on, there were, of course, feminist philosophers who reflected on the fact there's so few women in philosophy, and that philosophy itself as a discipline kind of conceives itself in very masculine terms, and it conceives itself as maybe being something that even like women are in some way ill-suited to do. I mean, that's like part of what is a little bit unusual about our discipline. I think more than any other discipline, it's had this history of repeatedly and like arguing for it, for why it is that women are not actually well suited to do philosophy. And when I started in philosophy as an undergrad, I think it just wasn't something that was talked about that much. I mean, like in terms of policy and in terms of questions about whether or not we should actually do something about it, that's changed so much now. There's just so many different programs and so much attention paid to, you know, different kinds of practices at the level of the institution and at the level of classroom engagement at every single stage, just like this kind of persistent question about are there enough women? Are we doing something to not, make philosophy feel as welcoming to women? So just the fact that that conversation is even happening and that it's happening so frequently and with its urgency is just such a difference from when I started, which was not even that long ago.
Yeah, for sure. I think, yeah, as you were saying, it's sort of something that a lot of different disciplines have been able, or a big change that's been affecting a lot of different areas of society. So that's good to see.
Right.
Um, let's see. And I know that you've also participated in a number of different philosophy outreach activities, including facilitating or judging high school and even grade school ethics discussion in Houston and even elsewhere. What has your experience been with these events, and how do you, I guess, what do you think the impact is for the younger students that you're reaching out to?
Um, I'd, I mean, I'm not sure about the impact. I would hope that it does expose them to philosophical thinking and like philosophical theories and ideas at an earlier stage than most American students uh, experience. Uh, and so, I mean, it can be quite rewarding. I do think though, like even though I'm really, really unsure about the the influence of this, probably the most rewarding for me was actually having philosophical discussions with like very young students, like in the second grade. That was actually just, I think because, they were so young that they really were not at all thinking about like winning arguments or, doing something extracurricular for their CV or something. Like those are all, understandable motivations for someone who's in junior high or high school to have. But like when they're in grade school, they're so unformed and they're so ready to just talk about things, and they just would say the funniest, like most honest things about what they thought the answer could be. They're not trying to like get to the right answer. They're just saying what they think the answer. And it was just so fun and so funny. And I really actually was doing that. And I don't know if I will again, as part of outreach, but that was just such a memorable experience.
Do you have any like examples or memories that come to mind?
Yeah, I do. A couple of different ones. I mean, so what we would do is we would read like a classic or sometimes newer philosophy, like, or sorry, children's books that had kind of like philosophical themes. One time we did the giving tree. And they were so young, they all just thought like, yeah, that's what, like, they had no sense that story sort of finishes with this, ironic look at like what it's like to have this tree who loved and gave everything of herself. And and as an adult you read that and you think, oh god, that's not like a healthy dynamic, but they were children, so they're like, yeah, that's exactly like what I expect from my parents. So that was very cute. But I think probably the a really memorable discussion was, we were talking about this, so it's like this philosophical topic, personal identity, right? So the question is like, what is it about you that makes you essentially you? If there, like that, there might not be really an answer to that, but and so but the pretense is that we could isolate like something that makes you distinctly you. And of course, like theological pictures will be like, it's your soul or something like that, right? And so I was talking to the students and I was getting them to, the kids really, and I was trying to get them to see the force of the problem, because I'd be like, well, what's something that's distinctive about you? And they would start off and they'd be like, well, and this was in North Carolina, so someone would say, well, I live in North Carolina. And I'd say, okay, but if you moved, wouldn't you still be you? And they go, oh, right, okay, I would still be me. And then they'd say things like, I like the color pink. And I'm like, okay, but if you didn't like the color pink and you like purple instead, would you still be you? And they're like, probably. And so like we were just working through all these different answers that they were giving. And eventually there was this one kid and he was like, oh, I know, like it's got to be something that's kind of inside you, like inside you, because if you cut your hair, you're still you. And if when you cut your nails, you're still you. And if you moved, you're still you. And so, and I thought he was going to say, give the kind of like theological answer, which is that it's your soul that makes you you. Because it's a standard answer, even if it's not true. And I'm like, okay, like what's something like deep inside of you that makes you you? And he goes, my bones. Oh, that was just, I'll never forget that.
That's very sweet. That's so cute. Yeah, there's just something so refreshing about talking to really little kids. They just see the world in such an amazing way.
I know, I loved it. And I didn't even want to, I didn't want to push him on that. I just was like, okay, let's leave it at that.
Thank you for sharing. I think that about wraps up our career section for the questions. So if you don't mind, I was going to move into more about your personal life and your personal identity and things like that.
Sure.
So first, how would you identify yourself ethnically?
I am Chinese Canadian.
Awesome. And has your career in philosophy changed your way of life, or has it brought any new meanings to your life and the way you move about things?
Oh, completely. I can't even, it's like I think at some point, I don't know when, but at some point I realized just like how deeply it really informs so much of my life. At least the ways in which like I engage with philosophy. Like my philosophy, I think of as just sort of an extension of things that I'm thinking about in my actual life. And then reading philosophy often just, it kind of, even if I don't mean for it to, it just sort of comes back and informs other aspects of my life. But a lot of my friends are philosophers, or they're sort of philosophically minded. And so, yeah, I think I can't even point to like a distinctive way in which my life has changed. It's just so part of my life now.
Would you say, like, based off of how you grew up and the values that your family taught you, and then becoming a philosopher later on, has that changed a lot?
I see, like my own values.
Yeah, or
Uh,
in general, just because I was also going to ask about like how your upbringing, the lessons that your parents taught you, how that has kind of shaped your values and the way you sort of navigate life. But I also thought it would just be interesting since you have a career in philosophy, how that's affected things as well.
Um, I don't know if fundamentally my values have really changed. Like um, and it's hard to know when something counts as a change and when it just sort of counts as a development or of something that was already there. I feel like there's a way in which a lot of what I still believe in, what I defend and argue for, there's like respects in which that was always sort of there in the way that I was raised by my parents. I have a paper where that's about a certain ideal of love, uh, that I call gracious love, and people will like often ask me like, who, like, is that about like someone in your, and I don't really think it's about someone in my life exactly, but I do think like a certain inspiration for that is just my mother. And so like I don't really know that I've ever felt a real disconnect from my philosophical life and even like my early family life. I just think it's more of like a development and articulation of a lot of it. And of course, like some things have changed. And there were times, especially when I was like a teenager, where I think I believed a lot of things just to sort of be contrarian. And then I sort of grew out of them. And my philosophical views matured, but then also probably just like my actual outlook on life, I hope, has matured.
Do you have any examples of lessons or values that your parents really raised you on?
Yeah, well, raised me on, I think, is probably too strong. I mean, in a way, my parents were always very kind of hands off with me. They trusted me a lot, and they never like, I think this is a very different, this might be just such a difference in norms of parenting, or like contemporary parenting versus back then, or like their kind of like Asian parenting versus like North American parenting. But I never remember my parents like speaking to me as if they were giving me a lesson about something. Like they never interacted with me like that. Like, this is the way we do things. They were never like that. They just sort of were themselves. And of course they would have rules and stuff like that, but it was never like lessons about life or lessons about anything. It was just, here are the rules and here's what we need you to do and here's the stuff that's your own business. And but but I do think that my mom, again, like my dad also, like my dad is like the much more serious kind of, he's very serious, and there's ways in which I'm much more similar to my father. He's kind of serious and intellectual and like likes to like think through puzzles, and he's a very abstract thinker. He has tendencies to kind of space out and think about something in a way that an academic does, that I'm like, he's worse than me in that respect, even though he's not an academic. Whereas my mom is much more grounded and just like interested in like the real world. And she also has a kind of attitude toward life that's very just open to the fact that there's very little you can do to control the world, and you have to just accept so many things. You have to fight, but you also just have to accept that there's so many things you can't do anything about. And I think when I'm like consciously trying to remind myself of like an alternative to the way that I tend to see things, then my mom ends up being the inspiration for that, where she's just a little bit like looser and less serious and funnier and more open and really warm and stuff like that. So that she's kind of like, I'm less like her. And so I think that's why she ends up being the inspiration for me to kind of reconsider the ways that I might standardly be otherwise.
Yeah. And since you have an older brother and you also lived with your grandmother or grew up with your grandmother, right?
Mhm.
Um, would you say that aspects of their personality also kind of help you, or things that you've internalized and help you move through life the same way like your parents?
Yeah, probably. I mean, more indirectly, I think um my grandmother was a very, very ambitious and at the time like overly educated woman. She refused to marry until very late, for her generation, and she demanded to get an education. She became a gynecologist in Shanghai in the early 20th century, which is like extremely unusual. So there was a way in which I think in our family, especially since she was my father's mother, it was always just assumed that it wasn't weird for women to want that, to just have their own life and to not prioritize family life if they didn't want to. I ended up prioritizing my family life, but like I don't think it was ever, bizarre or weird that like I wanted financial independence, that I wanted a career, I wanted a vocation. And so that she was a big figure, I think, for those reasons. Um, and then I'm not sure exactly. I don't know if I can answer about my brother. We're too close in age. It's like too weird to think about.
Yeah, I feel that way about my brother too. Um,
Yeah, maybe I'll be able to look back at all of it and reach some conclusion about what it all meant. But like, I really have no idea.
yeah, that makes sense. I was just curious. But growing up, do you think there was a big generational or cultural gap between you and your parents and your grandmother?
Huge, yeah, totally, enormous. I can't even. Like, there's like kind of fundamentals that I think stays the same. My parent, fundamental values like I don't know. My parents were both very like decent, sort of upright people. I don't know if there's really a way to. There's something about that, like they're very careful about like, you have to be very careful about like, you know, living up to your obligations and stuff like that. But then at the same time, they're a little bit like, once you live up to your obligations, then like, you can have your own life and enjoy life and do whatever you want. They never like pushed me into an academic career. Um, and so there, but and so like I think there were big cultural differences, but because I think of that looseness of their attitude toward me as a person, they ended up having like an attitude that really helped me be more integrated with North American culture. So like when I first got, like, for example, like I got my first boyfriend when I was like 15. Um, and they were not happy at all. Um, I mean, I think for a lot of East Asian parents, like the idea of like dating or like all that stuff, they're just like, not until at least college or something. And so they were not happy about that. But at the same time, they didn't tell me that I couldn't. They didn't tell me I wasn't allowed. They made clear that they weren't very thrilled with it, but they never forced me not to, just like they never forced me really to do anything. And so I think even though there are some cultural differences like that one being a big difference, they never pushed the issue. And so we've always had a really good relationship. And I think there's ways in which they managed a lot of the tensions. I know, like, sometimes what happens with East Asian families is like you push your kid not to date forever, and then by the time you want them to get married, they're like, I've never even dated anybody, so how can I possibly get married now, right? And so um there's a way in which we could kind of navigate the difficulties and the tensions by just both of us being respectful but allowing a lot of distance in terms of like controlling or being or setting down like hard rules or anything like that.
Yeah, that's awesome. Let's see. What do you like to do in your spare time?
I I spend uh a lot of time so I spend a lot of time that's not strictly speaking work. I do read still a lot. And I still like, and I'm watching movies and like thinking about stuff. I'm like I talk to my friends a lot. Like I think I mean I really uh yeah, I spend a lot of time with my husband and I speak to my friends a lot. I would be I think like on a normal day I probably spend like 1 to 2 hours in conversation with somebody, which at some points I realize that that's a lot because it's not really a hobby. It's just what takes up my time, and I appreciate it. Uh, and so, and also because I don't live near a lot of my closest friends, so it ends up being like we just have to talk. And then, um, and then I love doing things in nature, hiking, um, just being out in the world. And what else? That's probably it. I don't really have that much time, on top of just, all the chores you need to do to keep your life in order. That's basically it.
Did you have any of favorite sort of nature spots around Houston that you would kind of try and visit every now and then?
Yeah, I did. Let me think. I mean, there's some obvious ones, but I think one of the less obvious ones, and I ended up writing like a little piece that was it didn't get published, but it was going to get published. But anyway, it was just like a little piece about this one place in Houston, which is, you're probably familiar with it because you live right near the campus, but it's the oak trees on North Street and South Street, and those boulevards, but specifically when all the herons are like nesting. Have you seen that?
I don't think I've seen the heron specifically, but I do remember the oak trees.
Yeah, so those oak trees themselves are so beautiful, but especially when the herons and all the water birds, for some reason, at a certain time of year, they all nest at the same time. And it's totally wild. It's insane. I think the nature that I liked in Houston, even though like the nature's in a way not very integrated with the city in terms of there being like, that's not true though, actually. There are a lot of parks in Houston. I think people don't realize how many parks there are. But it's true that you don't have this feeling of like wildness that you can have in like the West, basically. But there are like pockets of wildness, and I think that's like the crazy animal life, like the herons nesting, or the bats flying, or like when the grackles, like those little noisy birds, all get together in the huge swarms. Like those were the moments where like Houston just feels so crazy and alive and uncontrollable to me. And I loved seeing like thousands and thousands of grackles like flying over a bunch of like oil execs downtown, like trying to like get to their cars. Like some of those images are just so beautiful.
It gives me more of an appreciation for Houston scenery than I think I had before.
Yeah, I think, Houston is, in a way, I think because I've lived other places, also Houston, there's a way in which, because parts of it are so ugly, I think it can force you to like really appreciate the parts of it that are beautiful. I mean, also the wildflowers, when it's wildflower season, are just so incredible. Yeah, so it has its own kind of beauty.
It does. Thank you for sharing. Um, what does your heritage mean to you?
Um, my heritage is very confusing to me. I think it's probably confusing to lots of immigrants. Um, my hair, I think, what is the most persistent thing? I think probably the most persistent way in which my particular heritage informs my personality or the way that I see the world is like, um, it just gives me, I don't know what to say. It gives me a little bit of perspective on like my own problems. I think there's not been like a kind of social historical reckoning with what happened uh with the communist revolution in China. I don't know that there ever will be. And actually, like, I'm hesitant to even talk about it because the political situation is so awful. And to even bring up Tiananmen in China, to even bring up, how many people died from um, the famine, to bring up these very painful times that somehow my family survived through, is so politically fraught. And again, I don't know that there will ever be anything like an oral history that's open and available to other uh, uh, mainland Chinese immigrants who came out of that time period and didn't and weren't able to escape to Hong Kong or Taiwan or just immigrate earlier. I don't, and I don't know too much about like my family's particular history. I can sort of piece it together sometimes, and sometimes I'll talk to it, but it is still actually so painful for people that I tend not to. And I think there's a way in which sort of it's like seeing that my parents were still somehow kind of able to thrive, definitely able to thrive as people, not just like in their careers, but like as people. It just it it gives me it just gives me perspective about like the capacity for human beings to be resilient. But it also gives me, I think, a real sense of just how fragile the kind of peaceful existence we have in North America, relatively peaceful existence we have in North America is, and how rare it is, and how, just the crazy struggles that people have in other parts of the world. Like, I think that that's something that, I want to say North Americans who have only lived in North America or only have experienced, like there's a respect in which, this is just a generalization, but in general, I think people sort of lose some perspective about that. Like, I think they don't realize how bad things can be, but then at the same time, I think they tend to not realize how resilient human beings can be. So it's like two different aspects of that.
Thanks for sharing. I know that was kind of a big question to sort of sum up in a couple minutes, but thank you. Out of everything, this is also kind of another big question.
Yeah, sure.
But out of sort of everything in your life, if you could choose one thing that you're the proudest of, what would you say that it was?
I think my relationships, like my close relationships, I think, I think that's probably what I'm most proud of. It takes like a lot of luck, and it takes a lot of work. But if I'm just part of the work part, like it's not work. It's sort of like, it's not exactly work, but it is sort of like, it takes a lot to feel really and be really close with another person. And I think, yeah, I'm probably most proud of just like feeling like there are a good number of people that I feel like extremely close to.
That's really nice. Where do you feel most at home?
I feel most at home.
Or I guess it could also be an activity like, what do you feel most at home doing?
Oh, that's so hard. I don't know if there's like a place I feel most at home. Um, Other than just like literally in my house. No, I don't. Yeah, there's not a. I don't know. I don't have a strong sense of there being a place that, again, maybe this is because like I never really felt at home in Canada. And so, like the feeling of home is already sort of ambivalent to me. So I don't know, but I do feel more at home at this point in my life in the United States than I think I do in Canada, which is an odd thing, because I still don't feel very American in a lot of ways, but I feel more, I would say I feel much more, at least in certain parts of the United States. In Houston, I actually felt very, very much at home.
What advice would you give to anybody looking to pursue a career in your field?
Um, to not think that it will save you or redeem you. I would probably say that to anybody about any career. Sorry, one sec, my dog opened my door. But I think with philosophy, there's like a tendency for people to go into it. Like there's a lot of people who go into it, I think, because they had some big question that they were asking in their life, and they wanted to find something like an answer in philosophy. And I think that impulse is really important in philosophy. I think one thing that sort of depresses me about a lot of philosophy is when it's clear that someone actually doesn't care about the answer to the questions that they're asking. And so I think it's really important to be genuinely puzzled by something, like genuinely unable to feel like you can be satisfied without getting some clarity on it, if not an answer. But I also think that is also paired with like this real hope that somehow philosophy can make your life better overall, or make you feel like redeemed in some way if you could only think a little bit more. And I just think that is, it's sort of not the right, it's a totally understandable ambition, but I just don't, especially not academic philosophy. I think academic philosophy, for the most part, unless you really strike out and like or you really like, sorry, I don't know what baseball metaphor would be best, if you really get like a home run, maybe you can like have your philosophy answer that original question for you. But it's a career, it's a job. There's lots of parts of the job that are just awful. They're just parts of the job. And I think it's because of the current situation where philosophy departments are getting defunded constantly, and we have like hostile politicians, who are hostile to higher education in general. There will be fewer and fewer jobs in philosophy. And I think just the thought that you could have a job, it's very unlikely now to have a job in philosophy, and that you also needed to have the job in order to like make sense of your life as a whole. I think that can be really just damaging in a way that I would hope could be avoided for people. But yeah.
Thanks for sharing. This is kind of a similar question, but what advice would you give to young Asian American students or Asian American women with similar backgrounds to yourself?
I would say it's getting better than it was when I started. So if they're worried about feeling not welcome or alienated from the profession, I think it is by and large getting better. And then I would heavily qualify it by being like, make sure that there's something else in your life that you love and that you could conceive of doing, because ultimately it's a very non-prudential, non-rational thing to do with your life. I'm not, and that doesn't say you shouldn't do it. It's just, you should go into it knowing that it's just the likelihood of success is very, even not just success in terms of a career, but even just like philosophical success, like the likelihood of kind of even doing something that you feel like you're really happy with philosophically, for different reasons, can just be, it's just unlikely. Like, and I don't know if that's because, I mean, philosophy is like incredibly different. It's, on the one hand, it's a very natural thing to do. It's like the thing that human beings sort of always do, is to sort of think about things philosophically, but it's also just so difficult that I think it can really bring up a lot of feelings of inadequacy. And so, and I wish it wouldn't, but I think it just can just do that. And for a lot of people, even just the activity itself, not even and the like this ambition that some people have, right? Because you're thinking like, we've had this whole history of this discipline starting from Plato, and you're like thinking like, how can I possibly, and you can't, you'll never do that, but you have to be someone who has enough sense of their life that that's not going to be something that's really corrosive.
Well, thank you for your advice. That was sort of the end of the questions that I had prepared, but is there anything you wanted to touch on that we haven't had the chance to yet?
um I don't think so. I think that's, yeah, you covered a lot.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for agreeing to be interviewed on behalf of Paul. It was really a pleasure to talk with you about your life and your experiences.
Yes, thank you for having me. It was really nice to meet you.
You too. Okay, awesome.